I wasn't supposed to cry at gate 12, not on a Thursday, not while strangers pulled suitcases past me, laughing into phones, boarding flights to places they actually belonged. I, Irene Whitmore, 63, freshly widowed, clutching a purse filled with breath mints and memories, had just realized my daughter and daughter-in-law never intended for me to come along. You'll figure it out, right? Rachel had said, her tone sugar-slick and merciless, just before they vanished into security, first-class tags swinging from their luggage. Emily didn't even look back. My return ticket? Erased. My suitcase? Checked, then gone. My dignity? Quietly shredded beneath fluorescent lights. I didn't scream, didn't chase, just sat, frozen, as the realization washed over me, not that I was forgotten, but that I'd been erased on purpose. But even in betrayal, some doors open, and I was about to walk through one they never saw coming. 2 weeks after Walter's quiet funeral, the house grew heavier than silence itself. Irene sat at the kitchen table in one of his flannel shirts, sleeves too long, collar soft with years of wear. Sunlight poured through the lace curtain, lighting up dust motes that swirled in slow motion like time had forgotten how to move forward. That's when Emily had come in, shoulders tense, smile polite, Rachel trailing just behind her, phone still in hand. "Mom," Emily began, carefully placing her purse on the counter like she was stepping into a client's office instead of her childhood home. "Rachel and I have been thinking, maybe it's time you took a break." Irene blinked, her hands still wrapped around a lukewarm mug of untouched coffee. "A break?" she echoed. "A getaway, just a few days, San Diego, the ocean air, a nice hotel, maybe a massage. You've been through a lot." Rachel nodded enthusiastically. Spring break lines up with the kids being gone. We thought it'd be perfect. Just us three, a girls' trip. The idea felt surreal, even generous. Irene hadn't been outside her zip code in years, not since Walter got sick. The last time she'd seen the ocean, they'd both been 50, and still pretending retirement was decades away. "But flights aren't cheap," Emily added almost too casually. "We've all agreed to split the cost evenly. Makes it fair." "Fair," Irene repeated, as if trying on the word. It fit awkwardly. That night, she opened the old cedar box Walter had kept under the bed. Inside, his grandfather's pocket watch, one gold cufflink, and a bundle of photos from their road trip in '82. The watch didn't tick anymore, but it still felt warm in her palm. She sold it the next morning at a pawn shop where the clerk didn't ask questions. $600 in an envelope, her contribution. The next week was a blur of packing and pretending not to second guess. Irene chose her softest scarf, a wide-brimmed sun hat, and a novel she'd never finished. She tucked a small photo of Walter into the lining of her bag just under her blouse. The morning of the trip, Emily pulled into the driveway exactly 10 minutes early. She honked once, didn't step out. Rachel waved from the passenger seat, her nails perfectly manicured, already scrolling her phone. Irene double-checked her single suitcase, locked the house, and slid into the back seat. They didn't speak much on the drive. The GPS voice did most of the talking. At Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, things moved quickly. Emily and Rachel navigated the check-in like professionals, heels clicking, voices brisk and bright. Irene, unfamiliar with curbside drop-offs and digital boarding passes, just tried to keep up. Rachel flagged down a porter. "We'll check Mom's bag with ours," she said, not bothering to ask. "It'll be easier." "I'd rather keep it with me," Irene murmured, clutching the handle. "Mom," Emily said, placing a gentle but firm hand on her wrist. "You don't want to haul that through security. Trust us. We've got this." So Irene let go, watched her suitcase disappear behind a conveyor flap. Her heart tugged as it vanished. The picture of Walter folded neatly inside, her only pair of walking sandals, the scarf she loved. Inside, they breezed through the initial check-in kiosks, Emily tapping through screens quickly. Irene followed behind, clutching her folder. Itinerary, boarding pass, ID, everything organized the way Walter would have done. At the gate, something shifted. Rachel whispered something to Emily, who nodded, then turned to Irene with a practiced smile. "Hey, Mom, Would you mind holding our drinks for a sec? We'll go sort something out with the desk. Of course, Irene said, taking the 2 iced coffees. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Her name was never called. She approached the counter herself, the drinks now sweating in her hands. "Hi, I think there's an issue with my ticket," she began. "My daughters were just here." The attendant squinted at her boarding pass, fingers clacking across the keyboard. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There's no return flight booked under your name. There must be a mistake. They said, no reservation, just the one way." Heart pounding, Irene turned toward the security line. She spotted them just ahead, Rachel adjusting her sunglasses, Emily pulling a carry-on, both laughing, both walking away. "Emily?" she called. Emily half turned, annoyance flickering in her eyes. "We only booked you one way, Mom," she said. "You're retired. You've got time. You'll figure it out." Then they were gone, just like that, gone. The 2 iced coffees trembled in Irene's hands. She set them on the nearest trash bin and walked slowly toward a bench under the large terminal window. She sat, stiff, unblinking. A plane roared overhead. Another family passed by, the mother laughing, the toddler reaching out for her hand. No one looked at Irene. And for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't feel like someone who'd been forgotten. She felt erased. Irene sat still on the bench, spine straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. The overhead speakers hummed with flight announcements she no longer needed. The world moved on around her, efficient and indifferent. She didn't cry. Her eyes burned, her throat dry, but not a single tear fell. The pain was buried too deep to reach the surface. It had turned inward into something dense and cold. She didn't reach for her phone, didn't call Emily, didn't call Rachel, didn't even call Mary Beth, Walter's sister who lived only 40 minutes away. Something inside her, something long dormant, whispered, "Don't beg, not again." A few seats down, a woman in her 70s with a velvet travel pillow around her neck noticed her. She shifted closer, offering a gentle smile. "Missed your flight?" she asked kindly. Irene turned toward her slowly, offered a small, composed nod. "No," she said softly. "I'm just waiting to figure out what happens next." The woman blinked, confused, but respectful enough not to pry. She gave a sympathetic look, then leaned back and closed her eyes, letting the terminal noise lull her into nap. Irene leaned forward, opened her purse, and reached for a tissue. Her fingers brushed against a familiar texture, smooth cardstock, slightly bent at the edges. She paused. It was a business card, white, embossed, a name in deep navy ink. Margaret Ellis, attorney at law. Her breath caught. She remembered it now. Walter had slipped it into her wallet after one of their final estate planning meetings. "If something happens and I'm not around to help, call Margaret. She knows everything." Irene stared at the card like it had just spoken. The name pulsed with promise. Not just legal help, but something more powerful. Direction. Her hands steadied. She stood, knees aching but determined, and walked to the exit like someone who remembered how to move with purpose. Outside, the wind had picked up. March air, cool but not unfriendly, wrapped around her cardigan. A line of cabs waited just past the sidewalk. Irene approached the first. The driver, a man in his 50s, rolled down the window. "Where to, ma'am?" She glanced again at the card, then back at him. "Downtown, Peachtree Street, office of Margaret Ellis." "Hop in." The taxi pulled away from the terminal, merging into the chaotic hum of traffic. Irene didn't look back at the airport, let it vanish behind her like a bad memory she had no obligation to revisit. She watched the city blur past, billboards, pedestrians, office towers that stretched too high for comfort. She didn't speak. The driver didn't ask. She appreciated that. In the pocket of her cardigan, her fingers brushed something soft. Walter's handkerchief, still folded the way he always did, with the corners aligned perfectly. She held on to it now like a talisman. At a red light, the cab passed a flower shop. A little girl in a red coat stood on tiptoe, pressing her face against the glass. Her mother crouched beside her, pointing at the daffodils in the window display. Irene turned away, blinked rapidly. Not yet. No tears yet. When they arrived, the office building was older than she expected. Red brick, ivy climbing up one side. A brass plaque beside the glass door read, Margaret Ellis and Associates, Family Law, Estate, Elder Rights. She paid the fare in cash, thanked the driver, and climbed the steps slowly but without hesitation. Inside, the receptionist looked up. Young, cheerful, professional. Do you have an appointment? No, Irene replied, but I think Margaret will want to see me. Before the woman could respond, a door opened down the hall. Margaret Ellis stepped out, dressed in slate gray with silver hair swept into a French twist. Her eyes landed on Irene and softened immediately. Irene Whitmore, she said, striding forward with both hands outstretched. My God, it's been, 5 years? Closer to 7, Irene said, her voice low but steady. Walter used to say if anything ever happened and he wasn't around, I should call you. Margaret nodded solemnly. He told me the same. The receptionist stood, flustered. Would you like me to... No need. Come on back, Irene, Margaret said, already leading her down the hall. The office smelled of old paper and faint lavender. Irene sat in the same chair she and Walter once occupied, back when life had boundaries and certainties. Margaret took the seat across from her, folding her hands. I won't insult you by asking how you're doing, Margaret said gently, but I will ask, what happened? For a long moment, Irene said nothing. Then, like pulling a thread from fabric, she began to speak. She told Margaret about the flight, about the bag, the one-way ticket, the way her daughter's voice had no hesitation, the way Rachel hadn't even looked back. By the end, her voice had lowered to a whisper. Margaret didn't interrupt. When Irene finished, she sat quietly for a moment before opening her desk drawer. You know, she said, retrieving a leather folder, Walter left a note for you. I wasn't sure if I should ever give it to you unless you came here. He gave it to me during our last meeting. Irene's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the envelope. On the outside, in Walter's handwriting, for Irene, in case. She didn't open it. Not yet. Not here. I need to make changes to the will, she said, her voice regaining weight. I want them removed. Completely. Margaret met her eyes, calm and sure. We'll take care of it. And just like that, Irene began again. The soft rustle of papers was the only sound in Margaret's office for several minutes. Irene sat still, hands resting in her lap, as Margaret flipped through files and scanned the contents. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was weighted, respectful. Two women who understood the value of silence when truth hung in the air. Irene, Margaret finally said, sliding a thin folder across the desk, I want you to see something. Irene leaned forward, opened it. Inside, a single page, a draft will from 7 years ago. Walter's signature was already in place. Her eyes skimmed the familiar sections, house, savings, land parcel in Tennessee. Then she saw it. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in Walter's unmistakable scrawl, if they ever hurt her, if she's betrayed or forgotten, she has my blessing to remove them all. Irene's breath hitched. Her thumb brushed the edge of the page. He said that? She whispered. Margaret nodded, eyes soft. He didn't trust easily, but he trusted you to know when enough was enough. Irene sat back, spine straighter than before. The words on the page weren't a suggestion. They were permission, liberation. I want to start the process, she said firmly. No hesitation, no half measures. Margaret leaned forward. We'll amend the will, remove Emily and Rachel entirely. No residual clauses, no fallback beneficiaries. Everything to be redirected. To where? Irene asked, though the answer was already blooming in her mind. There's a foundation. Silver Refuge. Walter mentioned it once. Housing, legal protection, and community for elderly individuals who've been isolated or discarded. Yes, Irene said. That's exactly where it should go. Margaret nodded again, already pulling up documents on her monitor. I'll draw up the revisions. You'll need to sign and notarize. Irene watched her work, her heart pounding, not with anger, but clarity. She wasn't doing this to get even. She wasn't here to punish. She was reclaiming what was hers. Her name, her worth, her autonomy. She glanced at the envelope Walter had left her, still unopened beside her handbag. Just the sight of his handwriting grounded her. He knew. He always knew. Margaret looked up. "You doing okay?" "I think I am," Irene said. "Better than I've been in a long time." The next few hours passed in a blur of signatures and scans. Margaret explained each step clearly, giving Irene control over every line. By the end, a thick folder sat between them, sealed, notarized, and binding. "I want everything stored securely, Irene said. "Fireproof. Password protected, access limited to you and Silver Refuge's legal team." "You've got it," Margaret replied, then paused. "Are you sure you don't want to leave them anything? Even a letter?" Irene considered it. "They left me nothing, not even the dignity of goodbye." Margaret nodded once more and stood. "Then we're done for today." Outside, the sun was beginning to dip. The air was crisp, but not cold, carrying the faint scent of pollen and something new. Irene walked slowly to a nearby cafe. She hadn't eaten since morning. She ordered a bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese, the kind Walter used to call lunch for champions. As she waited, she pulled out the envelope he had left her. She opened it. Inside, one handwritten page. "My Irene, if you're reading this, then something went wrong. And I'm not there to stand beside you, to shield you, to tell you it's going to be all right. But I know you. I know the quiet strength you carry, the way your kindness can turn to steel when pushed too far. If they've hurt you, if they've forgotten what you gave them, you don't have to forgive. You don't have to stay loyal to pain. Let go, cut the cord, rebuild your life, not for them, but for you. Love is not silence, it is not surrender, it is not obligation. Love, real love, walks beside you, even when no one else will. I loved you. I still do." Walter Irene folded the letter slowly, tears threatening for the first time since the airport. Not tears of grief, but of gratitude. She finished her meal, wiped her mouth, and left a generous tip. The night sky was unfolding above her like a velvet curtain, studded with stars. She didn't know exactly what came next, but for the first time in months, maybe years, she was no longer afraid. Back at the motel, Irene packed with efficiency. The suitcase felt lighter this time, not just because she had less to carry, but because she had finally put down the heaviest burden of all, the past. 3 days after finalizing the will, Irene returned to her old house. Not with a suitcase or a key out of nostalgia, but in the back seat of a moving truck she'd hired from 2 counties over. She'd paid cash, requested 2 quiet men who didn't ask questions. The truck pulled into the familiar driveway just after 10 a.m., a time she knew Emily and Rachel would be at work, the neighbors likely out or distracted. The house looked smaller than she remembered, not in size, but in presence, as if the air inside had thinned, lost its warmth, its memory. Irene stepped through the front door with purpose, no hesitation. The movers followed behind, waiting. She walked through the rooms quickly, only stopping when something stirred in her gut. From the living room, she took Walter's reading chair, the green one with the worn arms and sagging cushion, shaped perfectly to his back. From their bedroom, she retrieved his navy blue cap from the nightstand drawer, a quilt her mother had stitched for their wedding day, and the photo album from their 25th anniversary trip to Oregon. Everything else, furniture, kitchenware, the paintings Emily once insisted they hang, she left untouched. In the hallway, she paused outside the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. For years, it had doubled as storage. Boxes of winter clothes, old tax documents, knickknacks. On impulse, she stepped inside and pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk. A drawer she'd never bothered with. Just receipts, she always assumed. Nothing important. But tucked beneath a stack of outdated manuals was a white envelope with her name scrawled in Walter's handwriting. Her stomach dropped. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, shorter than the one from Margaret's office, but heavier in weight. Not just paper, not just ink. Irene, if you're reading this, it means the worst has happened. Not just that I'm gone, but that someone you trusted has broken what we spent our lives building. I don't know what shape that betrayal takes. I don't want to imagine it. but I need you to understand something I was too afraid to say out loud while I was here. I always feared Emily would change, not because she's cruel, but because she doesn't understand the value of sacrifice. She was born into comfort, shielded from the hard parts. You carried the weight and she never saw it. I know you've defended her. I know you believe she means well. Maybe she does. But love without empathy becomes entitlement. And entitlement, it devours. Don't let her rewrite who you are or what you gave. If this letter finds you after such a moment, then I beg you, protect yourself. Not just with law, with resolve. Some legacies are gardens, others are fences. Choose wisely. Love always, Bani. Irene sat down on the edge of the guest bed, the paper trembling in her hands. He knew. She had spent years brushing off his quiet concerns, insisting Emily just needed time, that motherhood would mature her, that Rachel's sharpness would soften. But Walter had seen what she didn't want to, the slow erosion of empathy behind polite smiles and well-timed gifts. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in her purse beside the other. Then she stood. "Only 2 more things," she told the movers. They nodded, waiting. She entered the study. Walter's old desk still stood by the window, facing the magnolia tree. She opened the center drawer, pulled out his fountain pen, and took one final blank page from the leather notebook they once used to plan their retirement. Sitting at the desk, she began to write. Not another letter, not to Emily, not to herself, but an addendum, a final clause. A copy of this letter is to be attached to the revised will and read aloud only if contested. It stands not as evidence of anger, but as proof of foresight. Let it be known that my husband, Walter Whitmore, foresaw the path of betrayal. His words, preserved by his own hand, confirm that the decision to disinherit Emily Whitmore and Rachel Lynn was not born of impulse, but of clarity. Let this serve as a legacy of love and warning. She signed it, dated it, and placed it in a sealed envelope marked, "To accompany revised will," in event of dispute. Then she walked to the kitchen counter, placed the house keys in a small ceramic bowl, and beside it, a folded slip of paper with 3 words: "Don't call, don't ask." She left the house without looking back. The ride back to the motel was quiet. The movers drove. She sat beside the green armchair, her hand resting on the worn fabric as if Walter might reach up and squeeze her fingers. At the motel, she tipped them generously and requested the boxes be brought only as far as the entrance. She would unpack alone. That night, she sat by the window with the chair facing the city skyline, the letter from Walter in her lap, and the new will folder resting beneath it. She no longer lived in that house, but she'd never been more at home. Willow Creek wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a modest U-shaped complex with white siding and pale blue shutters. It sat at the edge of a sleepy town that rarely made it onto maps or lists. But for Irene, it was perfect, unassuming, quiet, a place where no one knew her name unless she told them, and that was the point. She moved in on a Thursday, bringing only what mattered: Walter's green chair, the wedding quilt, the photo album, and 2 envelopes, one containing her future, the other, her husband's voice from beyond. The staff welcomed her with polite warmth. No questions about family, no sympathetic tilts of the head, just simple introductions and directions to her unit, Unit C7, with a small courtyard view and a sliding glass door that opened to a patch of daffodils. Within her first week, Irene planted lavender in the soil box outside her door, joined the Wednesday morning book circle, and signed up for gentle yoga for aging bones, though she mostly just watched. It wasn't the activities that mattered, it was the space, the air, the distance from everything that had defined her for too long. At Willow Creek, no one asked what she'd done before. No one cared that she used to be someone's mother or someone's wife. Here, she was just Irene. And it was enough. Every morning, she brewed tea, opened the sliding door, and sat in Walter's chair with the newspaper spread across her knees. At precisely 9:00 a.m., someone from the staff would walk by and say, "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore," and Irene would smile and nod, the sound of her name, used without expectation, settling into her like a balm. She was no longer needed, but she was finally seen. During the second week, she found herself lingering longer after book club. Most of the residents didn't read the full novels, but they showed up anyway, eager to argue over characters and endings like they were talking about old neighbors. "I still think Eleanor should have left him," one woman declared during a discussion of a Victorian novel. "Too much brooding. You can't trust a man who broods in empty rooms." Laughter rippled around the circle, and for the first time in months, Irene laughed too. Not politely, not for show. It bubbled up from somewhere genuine, and it startled her. After the meeting, she lingered near the bookshelf, scanning titles. A low voice beside her spoke, deliberate and calm. "You taught, didn't you?" She turned. A man in his 70s stood a few feet away, tall, trim, with silver hair and a walking cane that seemed more stylish than necessary. "I'm sorry," she said. "You used to be a teacher," he repeated. "I could hear it in the way you talked about the main character. You paced your argument like a lesson plan." Irene blinked, caught off guard. "How would you know?" The man smiled. "I was a principal. 32 years. I know the signs." She chuckled softly, nodding. "Yes, I taught literature, high school, until Walter got sick." "Thomas," he said, extending a hand. "Thomas Everly. Irene Whitmore." He didn't ask about Walter, or the sickness, or where her family was, just smiled and said, "Well, Ms. Whitmore, I think your students must have been lucky." That night, Irene added his name to the short list in her journal under a column she'd titled, "People Who Call Me by My Name Without Wanting Anything." It had exactly 3 entries. In the following days, she and Thomas occasionally shared benches after lunch or exchanged brief comments on the books displayed in the rec hall. He never pushed, never hovered, just existed nearby, like a comfortable chair in a quiet room. One afternoon, he left a paperback on her doorstep with a note tucked inside. Page 87. You'll like how she says, "Goodbye." Irene flipped to the page and found a passage where a woman leaves a garden she once nurtured with love, realizing that letting go doesn't always mean defeat. Sometimes it simply means you've learned enough from it. She stared at the words for a long while, then closed the book and set it beside Walter's photo on her nightstand. Later that week, during gardening hour, Irene knelt in the soil bed near the community path. She wore her wide-brimmed hat, dirt on her gloves, the scent of rosemary and basil rising around her. A resident walked by and complimented her plot. She looked up, smiled, and for the first time in years said, "Thank you. It reminds me of something I used to care for before I learned to let it go." As the woman walked away, Irene sat back on her heels and watched the breeze ripple through the fresh leaves. No one here knew what she'd been through. No one whispered about betrayal or asked about children. They just saw her. And that was more than enough. The email arrived on a Sunday morning, tucked between a community newsletter and a promo for orthopedic shoes. Subject line, "Mom, please come home." Irene stared at it on the screen of her small tablet, her thumb hovering but unmoving. The name beside it, Emily Whitmore, was both familiar and foreign, like seeing your childhood address after years of pretending it didn't matter anymore. She didn't open it, not immediately. Instead, she placed the tablet down beside her teacup, picked up her watercolor pad, and opened to a fresh blank page. The colors were already prepared, soft greens, fading yellows, a splash of red. She dipped her brush in water, then pigment, then water again. She began with the outline of a single rose. Walter had loved roses, not for their appearance, but their complexity. "Beautiful and brutal," he once said, tending to the thorny stems in their backyard. "They'll cut you if you don't pay attention. But if you do, they bloom like secrets." Irene painted slowly, the brush gliding in gentle curves, blooming petal by petal. She hadn't picked up a paintbrush in over a decade. Not since her students asked her to help with a mural for the library wall. Back then, she'd painted in corners, leaves, shadows, never the center. Today, she painted the rose in full. Halfway through, she paused, wiped a spot of red from her knuckle, and looked out the window. The courtyard at Willow Creek was alive with early spring color. A nurse pushed a wheelchair beneath the dogwoods. Somewhere, a wind chime sang lazily in the breeze. The email remained unopened. She added another rose, not out of anger, but to remind herself that beauty, when reclaimed, is an act of quiet rebellion. By late afternoon, she returned to the tablet. Her tea had gone cold. The sky had started shifting from pale blue to the burnt edge of sunset. She opened the email. Mom, we got a letter from Margaret Ellis, a formal copy of your will. I guess that means it's official. I won't pretend I understand everything, but I wanted to ask something. The garden, behind the house, it's still there. The kids helped plant it. I know you put love into it. Rachel and I were thinking maybe we could keep it. Just the garden, not the house, not anything else. It would mean something to us. It's peaceful there. Please. Emily. Irene read it twice, then a third time. There was no mention of regret, no admission of what had happened at the airport, no acknowledgement of silence, no apology, just a request. Can we keep what you built, even if we erased you from it? She turned back to the roses on the page. The watercolor had dried unevenly, the red bleeding into the edges, imperfect yet alive. She reached for a pen, uncapped it, and wrote a single sentence beneath the painting. They never asked how the garden grew, only if they could have it once it bloomed. She looked out the window again, watching the leaves stir like they were trying to whisper. Then she whispered too. That was never your garden. The words surprised her with their sharpness. Not bitter, not cruel, just honest. Like something that had lived too long inside finally found its voice. She didn't reply to the email. She didn't forward it to Margaret. She didn't even delete it. She simply let it sit there, unopened by response, but seen. At dinner that evening, Thomas sat across from her in the cafeteria. He asked nothing, said little, just passed her the butter when she reached. You seem quieter than usual, he offered gently. She smiled. Quieter, maybe, but not smaller. He smiled back and raised his glass of water. To that. Back in her apartment that night, she placed the rose painting beside Walter's photo, anchoring it with a small ceramic paperweight. She lit the candle beside it, the one she lit every night just before bed. Outside, the garden at Willow Creek grew steadily. No one demanded it. No one claimed it. Residents watered when they remembered, trimmed when they felt like it, and somehow it flourished. Because what grows best isn't what's owned. It's what's left to breathe. Irene sat at her desk as twilight settled gently over Willow Creek. The soft hum of the hallway lights, the muffled sound of a distant television, the rhythmic ticking of the small clock beside her, all of it formed a kind of cocoon, safe, still. Her journal lay open in front of her, untouched since the day she'd written Margaret's name on the inside flap. Tonight, the page would not hold groceries or memories. Tonight, it would hold a letter. Not to Emily, not to Rachel, not even to Walter, but to someone she had nearly forgotten, the version of herself that once begged to be needed. She uncapped her pen and began, To the woman I used to be, you were good. Even when they didn't say so. Even when they rolled their eyes or walked away or asked too much and gave too little. You gave love like it was breath, without hesitation, without condition. You believed if you bent far enough, they would finally see you. And when they didn't, you bent further. Irene paused, her fingers tightening slightly around the pen. She inhaled, deeply, steadied herself. You mistook silence for peace, obedience for harmony. You confused endurance with love. But that's not your fault. You were taught that love meant staying, that mothers are meant to be quiet, to sacrifice, to disappear when it makes others more comfortable. You stayed after the first insult, after the forgotten birthdays, after the holidays where your name was just a second thought behind hotel bookings and filtered photos. You stayed because you were loyal, and no one ever told you that loyalty without reciprocity is a slow erasure. Her pen slowed. She pressed the page with her palm, smoothing out the edge where her handwriting trembled slightly. You survived the day they left you at the airport. You sat on that bench, humiliated and invisible, and still you didn't cry. not because you weren't broken, but because the pain had lodged itself so deep it no longer had a voice. You thought about calling. You thought about begging, but you didn't. And that's when something changed. The room had grown darker. Irene lit the small lamp beside her, its glow warm against the page. You stood up. You called a cab. You walked through the door of a lawyer's office and rewrote the story they thought they could control. You didn't do it out of spite. You did it out of clarity, because even love, especially love, has limits when bruised long enough. Her breath caught, not with grief, with recognition. I know you miss him. Walter. I do too, but he knew. He saw it. The slow unthreading of respect. The way they stopped hearing you, even when you whispered with everything you had left. He gave you the courage to choose something else. Not revenge, not righteousness. Freedom. You moved into a quiet place where no one knew your name, and still they saw you, called you by it. Without needing anything in return, you painted again. You laughed at book club. You grew basil in a soil bed meant for strangers and found yourself rooted anyway. Irene blinked quickly, wiping the corner of her eye, then continued, You have earned rest, not just sleep. You have earned peace, not just silence. You have earned joy without permission. And if anyone tells you that forgiveness is the high road, remind them, forgiveness is a gift you give to others. But freedom? That's the gift you finally gave to yourself. She signed the letter without a name, because it wasn't meant for one person. It was meant for anyone who had ever traded their voice for a place at the table. She folded the letter gently, placed it beneath the small candle she lit each night for Walter. The flame flickered low, calm. Outside, the sky had deepened into velvet blue. Lights blinked on across Willow Creek like quiet affirmations. Irene leaned back in Walter's chair and closed her eyes. She wasn't who she used to be, and that was the whole point. It was a Tuesday when Margaret showed up at Willow Creek, a thick manila envelope clutched beneath her arm and a wool coat that looked too heavy for spring. Irene met her in the courtyard near the lavender she'd planted 3 weeks earlier. They sat on a bench beneath the shade of a dogwood, its blossoms pale pink and fluttering like tissue paper. I thought I'd drop these off in person, Margaret said, handing over the envelope. Everything's finalized. The new will is filed. The foundation's been notified, and your instructions are sealed in our secure archive. Irene nodded, running a hand along the edge of the envelope. It felt strangely light, given how much it held. Margaret hesitated before adding, There's still time, you know, if you want to add anything. Irene turned to her, one eyebrow raised. For Emily? Or Rachel? Even a letter? A photo? Something? This, Margaret tapped the folder, this is the end of the line, legally speaking. For a long moment, Irene said nothing. Then she looked out at the garden, at the sunlight slipping through branches, and replied quietly, If I leave her anything, it will be absence, a silence large enough to feel. So she understands not everything is forgiven just because she's family. Margaret leaned back, exhaled. You're braver than most. Irene smiled faintly. I'm just later than I should have been. They talked a while longer, about nothing, about gardening, about books. Then, Margaret stood, squeezed Irene's shoulder, and left. That weekend, the Willow Creek Community Center hosted a public seminar titled Bridging Generations, Caring for Aging Parents in a Disconnected World. Irene attended out of curiosity. She hadn't planned to speak, just to listen. The hall was crowded, folding chairs lined in rows, coffee urns near the back. Residents and visitors mingled. Staff bustled about. A projector hummed on the far wall. Irene sat near the back, her shawl wrapped loosely over her shoulders, eyes half-lidded. Then she heard a voice, one she hadn't heard in months. I wasn't always close with my mom, the speaker said, but I never imagined she'd just disappear. Irene turned slowly. On stage, wearing a soft pink blazer and nervous smile, stood Emily. Her hair was shorter now, a bit darker. She held the microphone like it was anchoring her. She stopped answering my calls, Emily continued. Then came the letter from the lawyer that she'd rewritten the will, that she didn't want contact, that I'd lost her. Some in the audience nodded. Others frowned, arms crossed. But Irene just watched. Emily's voice faltered for a second, then steadied. And the truth is, I didn't know how much I needed her until she was gone. Until I realized the things I thought were small, like her coming to every one of my piano recitals, or always remembering how I liked my tea, those were big, bigger than I understood. Irene didn't move. Her heart beat slow and steady. There was no sting in Emily's words, no longing to interrupt, to correct, to rescue. She let her daughter speak. I think sometimes we only see our parents as extensions of our needs, Emily said, eyes searching the crowd. We forget they're people, that they can bleed, that they can walk away, even when they love us. A few in the audience clapped softly. Emily stepped down from the podium, wiping her eyes. Irene stood quietly from her seat in the back. She didn't walk toward the stage, didn't call out, didn't wait for Emily to notice her. Instead, she walked toward the door, slipping past a row of whispering women, past the refreshments, past the sunlight pooling across the linoleum floor. Outside, the air smelled like rain. She pulled her shawl closer, took a slow breath, and stepped onto the path back to her building. No confrontation, no closure, just the quiet certainty that she had chosen peace over performance. And somewhere behind her, Emily kept speaking into a microphone, unaware that the mother she claimed had vanished was, for one fragile moment, close enough to hear her break, but not close enough to save her. The flyer went up on the Willow Creek bulletin board quietly. No grand announcement, no fanfare. Just a single printed page with the words, Anonymous Reflections, a night of stories from lives less told. Irene had printed it herself at the front desk, using the staff printer and asking for help only with the stapler. She signed up under a simple pseudonym, Guest Speaker, Story Number 3. The event was meant to be small, maybe a dozen people. But by the time the folding chairs were arranged and the coffee percolator started to hiss, nearly 30 residents had trickled into the community hall. Some came out of curiosity, others simply for the promise of something different than bingo. Irene sat near the front in a charcoal gray shawl, the same one she wore at Walter's memorial. Not out of grief this time, but grounding. She waited until the second speaker finished, a man in his 80s who'd talked about building bicycles in his youth, then stood quietly and made her way to the front. She didn't take the podium. She didn't introduce herself. She simply began. I once knew a woman, Irene said, her voice even and low, who spent her entire life being useful to everyone but herself. The room grew still. Even the coffee machine seemed to hush. She gave without expecting return, smiled even when ignored, said yes when her heart said no. Because that's what women like her were taught. To be needed was to be worthy. Gisang. A few heads nodded in the second row. This woman had a daughter, and for a long time she believed love meant sacrifice, that if she gave enough, bent far enough, the love would reflect back. But it didn't. Not always. Her hands were steady, clasped before her. One day, this woman was taken to an airport, told she was going on a trip with family, told to pack light, told to relax. At the gate, they walked away without her. Someone inhaled sharply. Irene didn't look to see who. They left her with no return ticket, no luggage, no explanation, just a folder of papers and the echo of her own silence. Irene paused. She could feel the words vibrating in her chest, not with pain, but with power. But something happened that day, she continued. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She stood up. Walked out and rewrote the story she'd been forced to live for far too long. She scanned the crowd. She didn't do it out of vengeance or bitterness. She did it because, for the first time in her life, she realized she was not required to be loyal to pain. Silence. One woman in the third row, slight, hair tightly pulled into a bun, covered her mouth. Another leaned forward, gripping her cane. I don't know what happened to that woman after, Irene said. But I like to imagine she found a place where people called her name without wanting anything, where her worth wasn't measured by how much she gave, where she didn't have to be invisible to be loved. She let the words settle, then stepped back from the front of the room. No applause, just a pause, a breath, and then a voice, soft, unsteady. "She told my story," a woman whispered. Irene turned. It was the woman with the bun. Her hands shook as she dabbed her eyes with a floral handkerchief. "I thought I was the only one," she said. Irene said nothing, just offered a faint nod, one that meant, "I see you." Then another voice. "My son hasn't spoken to me in 3 years," someone else offered. "He said I was too much work." A few heads turned, not in judgment, but solidarity. "I gave up everything for my daughter," said another, "and she told me I was dramatic." The room unfolded. One by one, voices rose, tales of abandonment, of emotional bruises hidden beneath polite holiday cards, of being thanked publicly and forgotten privately, of disappearing in plain sight. Irene sat down among them, no longer separate, no longer anonymous, but she didn't need to reveal her name. They already knew her, not as Emily's mother, not as Walter's widow, but as someone who had survived and then chosen to live. That night, back in her room, Irene lit her candle. She placed a new page into her journal and wrote at the top, "What happens when you are finally seen by strangers more clearly than by family?" She didn't answer it. Not yet. Instead, she closed the book, sat in Walter's chair, and let the warmth of the flame wrap around her like a promise. The message came late one evening, tucked in Irene's inbox between a newsletter about elder yoga and an ad for vitamin D supplements. Just an audio file. From Emily Whitmore. Subject, "If this is the last thing you ever hear from me, please listen." Irene didn't open it right away. She closed the tablet, placed it gently on the nightstand, and lit her candle. The wax had melted into a low well, flickering steadily like a pulse. She stared at it for a long while, steadying her breath. Only later, when the building was quiet and the moon stretched pale fingers through the curtains, did she put on her headphones. Emily's voice came through, uncertain, softer than Irene remembered. "I don't know how to begin," she started, then laughed bitterly. "I guess I never really knew how to talk to you. I just expected you to always be there." There was a pause, a shallow inhale. "Rachel left," Emily continued. "She said she couldn't stay with someone who didn't know how to love back. She said, 'I won't become the kind of woman who treats people like disposable furniture.'" A beat. "I think she meant like I did you." The sound of a stifled sob came through the speakers, not loud but sharp enough to pierce. "I kept thinking you'd call me back, that you were just teaching me a lesson, that you'd forgive me like you always did. I didn't realize I'd reached the end of all my chances." Another breath, rougher now. "The house is still here. The garden's still blooming. The roses you planted came back this spring. I water them, but they don't feel like mine. They never did." The next words were barely a whisper. "I want you to come home, not for me, for you, for the part of you I broke. If you never speak to me again, I'll understand. But if there's even a thread left, I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry." The message ended in silence. No music, no signature, just the dull finality of a woman too late. Irene sat motionless. She didn't cry. She didn't clench her fists or curse the sky. She simply let the sound settle into the walls, into the fibers of the chair beneath her, into the candlelight flickering like it might understand. The phone on her nightstand buzzed. Emily's number lit up the screen. Irene stared at it, the soft blue light casting shadows across her face. She reached for it, held it in her hand. Her thumb hovered over the green icon, the line between connection and closure a single breath away. She let the phone ring once, twice numb. Then she pressed the red button. Decline. She placed the phone down, took off her headphones, and whispered to the dark, "I've gone farther than forgiveness now." The candle fluttered. Outside, the trees stirred in the wind. Inside, Irene leaned back in Walter's chair, her spine relaxed, her hands folded calmly over her lap. No regret, no tension. Not every story ends with reunion. Some end with a woman choosing peace over permission. And some don't end at all. They simply continue in silence. But this time, it's the kind that frees. Spring at Willow Creek had always arrived like a whisper, unassuming, soft at the edges. But this year, something was different. Irene felt it in the soil, in the way the air moved through her window, in the hush of morning that didn't feel empty, just open. She'd proposed the idea one afternoon at lunch, her voice steady but light. What if we made something together? A garden, but not for vegetables or decor, for memory, for strength. The director raised an eyebrow, curious. A garden? A community one, Irene said. Each of us could plant something. Something we've always loved, or something new. Doesn't have to be big, just chosen. By the end of the week, the back courtyard had been cleared, raised beds were ordered, a local nursery donated a few bags of soil and some trowels. Irene made a sign in careful cursive, the memory garden, what we choose to grow. Every Saturday, the residents came. Some in wheelchairs, some with walkers, others simply with aching joints and eager hands. They planted lavender, rosemary, forget-me-nots, marigolds, lilies, and even a rebellious tomato plant someone insisted on sneaking in. Irene didn't rush to pick her spot. She waited. Then one morning, Thomas approached her after breakfast, a small envelope in his hand. No label, he said, but they're real. My wife used to call them winter hearts. They bloom in the cold when everything else gives up. Irene took the envelope, her thumb brushing over the flap. That sounds impossible. He smiled. So did surviving. She planted them the next day, kneeling slowly in the soft dirt, her shawl folded neatly beside her. The soil was still cool from the morning air, but her hands were steady. She dug carefully, placed the seeds, and whispered to the ground, "Let this be the beginning." As she covered them, her thoughts drifted, not to Emily, not to Rachel, not even to Margaret's last visit, but to Walter. She could almost hear his voice, low and certain, from the years when their garden at home overflowed with wildness. "Don't plant for show," he used to say. "Plant what makes you stronger, not what makes others clap." Back then, she'd smiled and planted whatever Emily asked for. Sunflowers, tulips, perfect hydrangeas for family photos. Now she planted winter hearts. Flowers that didn't wait for the sun to thrive, that bloomed in defiance. Around her, the garden filled with chatter. Residents arguing over spacing, laughing at bent stems, praising the stubbornness of certain herbs. Irene listened, not as a guest, but as a host. Someone asked her if she had gardening tips. Another complimented her handwriting on the sign. A new resident waved from across the courtyard, a dirt-smudged glove raised in greeting. Irene waved back. No one here knew what had been taken from her, and it didn't matter, because here, she wasn't a story of loss. She was a story of what comes after. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and stepped back from her plot. The winter hearts would take weeks, months maybe, to bloom. But she didn't need to see them today. She knew they were there, planted in faith, watered in resilience, and chosen, finally, for herself. The garden had begun to take shape in more than just blossoms. It had a rhythm now. Saturday mornings full of laughter, Tuesdays with quiet watering and whispered stories. The wooden bench beneath the old elm tree became Irene's favorite place to sit, her journal resting in her lap, the same pen always tucked neatly between the pages. That's where she was when the little girl appeared. She couldn't have been older than 8. Barefoot in pink leggings, curly hair pulled back with a clip shaped like a butterfly. She wandered in from the side gate, probably a granddaughter of one of the residents visiting with her parents. But instead of rushing to find someone she knew, she made a beeline for Irene. "Are you the garden lady?" the child asked, tilting her head. Irene smiled. "I suppose I am." The girl plopped down cross-legged on the gravel. "They said you made this whole place." Irene nodded. "I had help." The girl was quiet for a moment, then asked, her voice soft but clear, Is it true what people say? Irene paused. What do people say? The girl looked nervous. That you're the lady whose kids left her, that you don't have a family anymore. For a heartbeat, the garden stilled. Not a sound from the other side. No rustling, no tools clinking, just the hum of bees and the long hush of wind through petals. Irene looked down at the little girl. Then she smiled, not bitterly, not sadly, but gently, like someone opening a window that hadn't been touched in years. People love to tell stories they don't understand, she said, but I'll tell you mine. The girl leaned in. I was once someone who gave and gave, thinking that was what love meant. I let people need me more than they saw me, and yes, one day they walked away. She took a breath, steady and sure, and for a while, I thought that made me abandoned. Didn't it? The girl asked. No, Irene said. It made me free. The girl blinked. I don't get it. Irene chuckled. That's okay. One day you will. She leaned down, brushed a leaf from the girl's knee, and continued, You see, I used to think being someone's mom or wife was who I had to be. That if they stopped loving me, I stopped being whole. And now? The girl asked. Now I know, Irene said, her voice strong but warm, that I don't belong to anyone who doesn't choose me, and I don't need anyone's permission to matter. The girl stood. I think that's really brave. Irene smiled. Sometimes it just feels quiet, but yes, quiet can be brave too. Will you show me your favorite plant? The girl asked. Irene rose slowly, stretching her legs, and led her to the far bed, the one near the back, shaded most of the day, the spot where the winter hearts had begun to push their way through the soil, not yet blooming, but green tips reaching stubbornly. These, she said, crouching beside them, they bloom in the coldest months. Why? The girl whispered. Because not everything waits for the sun, Irene replied. That evening, after the girl left and the courtyard fell into stillness, Irene returned to her bench. The journal sat open on her lap, the page fresh and white. She wrote, Some gardens are not planted for beauty. They're planted for proof that even what is buried can bloom again. The sun was beginning to drop, casting golden ribbons across the brick paths. Birds called from the elm tree. A soft breeze danced through rosemary and thyme. Irene closed her eyes, not as a woman grieving, not as a mother waiting, but as someone who had learned how to begin again without apology. The camera of life pulled slowly away as if giving her space. The bench, the garden, the scattered blossoms still wet from the watering can, and her, still, peaceful, not waiting for anyone, but finally, completely, home.